Hi there everyone, welcome back to the channel. So in this video, we are going to talk about rendering patterns in front end. So as a front end developer, you might have heard about different rendering patterns like server side rendering, client side rendering, static site generation, static rendering, incremental static regeneration, and whatnot. And you might be confused by hearing this term quite a lot. So in this video, I'm going to discuss all these terms in detail once and for all so that you don't have to watch any other video and you will have the clear idea about each rendering pattern, which rendering pattern to use when and how to use it. So without any delay, let's begin. So as you can see here, I've made a clear documentations and diagram for you in order to explain the rendering pattern. So I'm going to explain all of these rendering patterns with these documentations and clear diagram so that you will understand which rendering pattern to use, when to use and how to use it. Again, I'm going to discuss that part as well. So bear with me. Once you watch this video completely, you will be clear with all the different rendering patterns in front end and in React in general as well. So before understanding about rendering pattern, let us first understand with this term rendering. So what basically rendering is? So basically rendering simply means converting your code into visual content for users to see on their screens, right? So let's just say you have written some of the HTML, CSS and a JavaScript, right? So now in order to make that into UI, so browser does some of the rendering, right, in your UI, in the browser, in the user's browser, and then it creates some UI so that it can interact with it, right? Like some sort of button, like as we can see here, we have sharing button and all this screen, right? So browser takes all this HTML, CSS and JavaScript and then basically it turns into a web page so that user can interact with it. So that's what rendering basically means. And if you're using a library like React, that means we basically use JSX in React, right? And what is JSX? JSX is basically just your HTML like syntax which helps us to create the UI elements. And now we need to render that UI JSX or HTML like UI elements on the browser, but a browser does not understand that JSX, right? So we need to render that UI on the browser, but browser can only understand HTML, CSS and JavaScript. So before rendering that process, we need to convert our JSX, which is our HTML like syntax which we have written in React, into respective HTML, CSS and JavaScript. Then only browser can understand. So basically we need to convert that JSX into HTML, and that conversion and for in order to convert that, we have different type of rendering patterns, right? So we have rendering patterns like client side rendering, server side rendering, static site generation, incremental static regeneration, and now we have one more rendering pattern which is React server components. So some of you might be thinking React server components and server-side rendering is same, but no, there is some certain difference between server-side rendering and the React server components. I'll discuss that as well. So first, let's understand with the client-side rendering part. So what is CSR or your client-side rendering? So always understand where does the rendering happens or the conversion of JSX happen basically, right? So if it is client-side rendering, then the conversion of your React JSX happens on the browser because it says client-side rendering CSR. It means rendering happens on browser. So here in this case, when you load a web page which is built out of React, you only get a blank HTML file and JavaScript is sent to the browser. Now the browser runs that JavaScript to build the content dynamically. So as you can see, this is the entire diagram that I have built. So this is the client browser. So client browser basically now what it does is it sends an HTTP request to your web server, and basically web server basically sends you the initial HTML response, right? And then now it basically client browser loads that initial HTML response, and then after that there it finds a JavaScript bundle script tag. Now it requests for that JavaScript back to the server, and then after that this server again sends that JS bundle to the client. Right now this is your JSX bundle, right? So here you don't see any HTML. Now that JSX needs to be converted into the HTML. So now your browser here, it starts doing that, right? It executes a JS. Now JavaScript render runtime is there and it renders the JSX, where it goes to the React virtual DOM and it get converted into the real DOM, which is a browser DOM, and then it finally displays or render your web page. So this is the entire client-side rendering process. So in short, you need to understand that the conversion of JSX to HTML is happening in the client browser. So that's what client-side rendering means in your browser, right? So when to use client-side rendering? So let's say, so the pros of client-side rendering is you have got smooth and fast navigation after the first load, right? And it reduces the load on your server also, and it is good for building web app or dashboard type of application if you want to provide native live experience to the user. So let's just say you want to build some certain web app where you don't care about the initial load time, you're okay with a little bit delay for the initial load time, but once the entire web page is loaded, you want to make sure that your entire web app is smooth. As soon as user clicks the button, it needs to go to the next page instantaneously. Then in this case, you want to give some sort of an app like native like experience to your user. So in that case, React client-side rendering is the best way to do in React, right? So in that case, you do client-side rendering, and another benefit of client-side rendering is it reduces the load on the server as well. So as you can see here, for the first load, there is a lot of back and forth. It sends initial response, and then it asks for the JS bundle. It sends a JS bundle, right? So client to web server, there is a lot of back and forth, but this is only for once in the initial time. Once this is happen in the bundle JS, you get all your HTML and different pages. Now you can load everything instantaneously. So that's the benefit of client-side rendering, but it has got some cons as well. So the cons are it is slower in initial load time, right? So let's just say you don't care about the native like features. This is like your some sort you want to build some sort of a landing pages where your user wants to see the page instantaneously, or you're building some sort of an e-commerce where your users wants to see the product listing or product detail page instantaneously. So in that case, client side rendering would negatively impact, because for the initial load time it is going to take a bit extra time, and another negative is for poor SEO, right? So if you're building some sort of SEO driven pages, then also you have negative impact. You should not use it, and the reason is pretty simple, right? In order to understand the content of your page by the Google, it needs to crawl your HTML. But as you can see here, it sends the JS bundle from the server to the client. So Google crawler does not understand this JS bundle. JS bundle is just like your JSX, it's a HTML like syntax, but it is not HTML, and Google crawler does not understand JSX, right? And this JSX get converted into HTML only in the browser, so that Google crawler won't have any idea about your basically meta tag or meta description and whatnot, and for that reason your SEO is going to be negatively impacted, right? And now we have another type of rendering pattern as well, which is server side rendering. So what is server side rendering? Here rendering happens on the server, so that basically means in server side rendering your JSX is getting converted into HTML in the server itself, right? So in client-side rendering, JSX was getting converted in the browser in the client, but in server-side rendering, JSX is getting converted into HTML on the server, right? The server builds the full HTML for the page and send it to the browser, and browser basically displays a fully formed HTML page immediately after receiving it. And this is what the entire diagram looks like. So this is the client browser. You hit example.com, it sends the HTTP request to the server, and it checks, let's just say if you want to make some sort of API call or not, let's just say example.com also has some sort of a data. So you're making that API call also on the server as well. And from there, you're making request to the database or external API, right? And you get that data, and it takes the data. Let's just say it is the product listing page you are visiting. So it makes an API call for the product listing. You get all the product details, and it loops through all the product. All this is happening in the server, and it creates all your HTML, right? And it renders out the HTML, and then it creates a full formed HTML. And basically finally, once full formed HTML is formed, then server finally sends you the HTML response with full formed HTML to the client, right? So with that, what happens is your browser, your initial load time is going to increase, and also your SEO is going to be improved. Why? Because like search engine can easily crawl your content, because this is fully formed HTML that your server is sending to the client browser. So doing so, basically Google crawler will easily understand the HTML, and it can rank your pages. So your SEO will improve, and you will have faster initial page load time. So if you have a product listing page or product details page which your users wants to say instantaneously, then doing server-side rendering is a better idea. But it has got some cons as well. You have slower subsequent request, right? or slower subsequent interaction because it has server dependency. Now let's just say you want to go to the another page, then you need to make the same trip to the server again and again. Whereas in client-side rendering, if I go top here, you just make one server request, right? Here in the initial only you get multiple trips and you get that JS bundle, and whenever you try to open some sort of a pop-up or you want to go navigate to the next page, you can navigate it instantaneously. But here you need to make this request again and again because it is server dependent. So subsequent request will be a bit slower. That is the negative point. And another is it's very hard to provide native like experience to end user because on every click you're making a trip to the server. Unlike in client-side rendering, you have all your pages and data, everything on your client once it is sparse, right? So hard to provide native experience. And another is increase server load. So how does this increase the server load? Let's just say you hit example.com/products and you're getting the product. As soon as you hit, it makes a request to the API, right? And then after that, it renders the HTML, it gets the data and makes full form HTML and it sends to the client browser, right? It has done one time. You hit it again it will go through the same process, and all this extra load which earlier used to happen in the browser server was only for you sending the files. Now it is processing all this data as well. So for that reason, it is increasing extra burden in the server as well. Now we have another rendering pattern as well, static site generation, right? So now once we are done with CSR SSR, let's understand SSG, which is static site generation. So in static site generation, basically your HTML is pre-rendered at the build time only, right? And it also makes an API call to get the JSON data and creates a full HTML response during the build process, right? A server generates HTML for all pages in advance, not during the user request. So what does this mean is basically, so whenever you are deploying your React or Next.js application, remember you go through a build phase. So whenever you are building that, at that moment only, if you're opting for static site generation, then it converts all your JSX into HTML during that build phase only. And if any API call needs to be made on that page, it will make that API call as well and convert all that into basically HTML in the build phase only. So as you can see, I've created the diagram as well here. So this is your static site generator. Basically here you have web browser, right? And you have your server, and here this is the build process. So all your content, right? Employed HTML file, data source, let's just say this is your API call that you're making, this is your content tags, and then this is your HTML tags, right? And it is going to static site generator in the build process. So and all this conversion will happen in the build time only, and it will create your static HTML file, static CSS and static JavaScript, and it will give you to the server. Now once you make a server request here, if you go to the example.com/product, let's just say, now server does not have to do all those things. When you go to the example.com/product, all these things are actually already done in the build phase only. So when you are deploying, server already gets your HTML, CSS and JS file. So when you're making to/product, it will only send your HTML, CSS and JavaScript. So it does not have to go through this extra computation. All this computation will happen on the build only, right? So it will generate statically for you. So that is known as static site generation. So it has some pros and cons as well. So let's go through the pros. So pros is you will have lightning fast performance, right? No server processing at request time. When you go to the /product, server does not have to make that API call again, convert it into HTML and set to, that processing is not required. All this processing is already done in the build time. So now you server just need to return those HTML, CSS and JS files. So static site generation or static file becomes lightning fast. So it's pretty fast, right? And it is great for SEO as well because all that thing is already done. Google crawler can crawl it, and it scales well with low server cost as well, right? Because the burden to the server is very less, right? So that is one thing. And you can also integrate your API call, but if the response is not very much dynamic on per user basis, if you're not customizing based on several users, it's just a generic API call you're making, then you can make that API call as well, right? So statically basically generated piece also, you can cache that also by CDN. You don't need any extra configuration to boost the performance. But in some cases like server-side rendering might only be option. You need to remember that as well. Because let's just say there is some PAs where you want to show different information to different users based on user ID, right? So in that case, you can never understand which user is accessing that page, because you are converting all that and making an API call on the build only, right? So you have no idea about the user ID. So for that case, you need to do server-side rendering only. But if it is a generic API call, then where you are showing same data to all the user, then basically you can do that as well. And as I said, the another major advantage is you can use something like CDN, maybe like Amazon CloudFront, and cache it as well. So these are the advantages of static site generation. The cons is challenging to use for frequently updated content, right? Let's just say, because all that HTML conversion happens during the build phase only, and it is there static, right? It is not going to change anything. So if it is something which is going to update frequently, then it is going to be challenging. You need to rebuild it again and again, right? So rebuilding can be time consuming again for large sites, right? You don't want to build it again and again. Even if your website is very small to medium size, then also the building time will be around 5 to 10 minutes, right? So depending on your website, and if it's a pretty large scale application, then it can go from 1 to 2 hours as well. So just to update the content, you don't want to go through build phase again and again. So these are the cons of basically static site generation. And now we have something known as static rendering. So static rendering is basically a subset of static site generation, or SSG, where every page is 100% pre-rendered without any dynamic content or API call. Like basically static site generation and static rendering is same, but in static site generation, we have some generic API call that we want to make. So along with the data, it converts all that into the HTML. But if there is no API call also needs to make, it's just the plain JSX that is going to be same for all the user, and you can simply statically render instead of static site generation, right? So it is ideally true for static content like blogs or documentation, and like the pros and cons are same as of static site generation, right? Because it is the same thing only, the only difference is a API call or the JSON data. And now finally we have one more rendering paradigm that is introduced recently these days, which is known as React Server Components, or RSC. So basically React Server Components, or RSC, splits the render between your server and client. So the server renders components that you can render a particular component in the server which is not very interactive, right? So that kind of component you can render in the server, and whichever the component which is highly interactive or dynamic, then you can choose to render those component on the client, right? So it's a hybrid approach, right? In pure server side rendering, everything is server side render, and in pure client side rendering, every page is all the pages client side rendering. But with the help of React Server Components, let's just say a particular section of your component, let's just say a recommendation section, which is highly dynamic and very much interactive, then you can render that particular component on the client. But let's just say there is a hero section which just has a basically image and some text and a particular search bar, which is going to be same for all the users, then basically which is not very interactive as well. So for that reason, basically you're going to render all that component in your server. So basically you can choose, it gives you that hybrid approach, and you can decide which part of your page you want to render from the server and which part of your page you want to render from the client. So that is your React Server Components. And this is the diagram here. You can see basically this is the client browser, right? It is making a request to the server, and RSC render is there. Basically there is this React Server Components, it is generating HTML, and it is also giving you very minimal JS, because in client side generation you get a very big large JS bundle. You don't need that thing, you get a very minimal JS, and basically it sends to the client browser and it is going to render. So again, the pros is reduce this JavaScript sent to the browser. You send very less JavaScript to the browser, so you don't have all that main thread blocking issues for performance optimization, right? So it again improves your performance by rendering on the server for non-interactive components. Just for rendering non-interactive components, you don't need to add additional JavaScript, right? So you can easily avoid that. It minimizes your client-side JavaScript, reducing your overall bundle size. Also, it introduces server and client components approach, right? So due to which your code can become much more modular and efficient, giving you the full control to choose which components you want to render on server and which components you want to render on the client. So you have full control on that. As a con, I would say this is still a fairly new concept and may require of some of the adapting workflows, and you might want to research around a bit, right? So if you want to use React Server components, then React 18 has just launched, so you can just install React 18 and then start using React Server components. Or you can also go for Next.js app router. Next.js app router already uses under the hood React Server components, where you have the flexibility of choosing a particular component as server component and a particular component as a client component. It's very simple. All the components in Next.js app router by default are server component, and if you want to make any component client component, then you just need to add a directive, which is just a string inside the curly braces, right? Inside the invitation comma, something like that, and you just need to type use client. That's it, and then your entire component becomes like basically client side rendered, right, in Next.js. So if I open use client, and you can see this is the client component, so you just need to add this use client and directive, and this entire components become client side rendered. And if you don't add this use client directive, then by default all this component will be server side rendered in Next.js app router, right? And if you want to go through pure server side rendering, you want to render everything on the server side rendering, then Next.js pages router will also gives you that. You just need to use get server side proc function. It will give you that data, and your whole pages is going to be server side rendering. You can also do all your pages server side rendering, obviously in app router as well. Just don't add this use client directive, then by default every single component, every single page is server side rendered. But there will be some of the use cases where you want to add a particular component which is a client dependency, which is highly interactive, so you want to make that client side rendered, then you can just add this use client directive, and it is going to make a client side rendered for you, right? So that's the flexibility you get with React Server components. So all right guys, so here I have discussed all the different render patterns paradigms which exist in the front end and in React ecosystem in general. I hope it is clear. So if you like this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. It motivates me to make more such content, and I'll see you all in the next video.